A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we are going to study migration and human rights. So, broadly, there are two parts to the lecture today. In the first part, I'll fundamentally focus on what do we mean by human rights. And for this, I want to go back to the foundation, spend some time discussing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then I will look at the global framework of the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, specifically focusing on migrants' rights. And this is largely for you to understand the global architecture for migrant human rights today. And then in the second part of the lecture, I want to spend some time, discussing that if we have such a progressive global framework of human rights, then why is it that the empirics of migrant rights are in such dire straits? So, for this, we will focus on Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues' work on the structural aspects of neoliberal economic development. And this is how then we can understand the tensions between the migration and development discourse and the migration and human rights discourse. And then, then we conclude by their point on, therefore, reframing the debate on migration and development and human rights in a post-neoliberal world. So, as some of you may be familiar, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a document which really it's a global document, it's a historical document, and it literally acts as a global roadmap for freedom and equality. And what it fundamentally does is it protects the rights of every individual anywhere in the world. And this is also, in the post-war scenario, in the post-World War II scenario, where for the first time countries in the world came together and agreed on the freedoms and rights that deserve universal protection in order for every individual to live their lives freely, equally, and in dignity. So, you can see that the Article 1 is just very, very fundamental. It's about all human beings being born free and equal in dignity and rights. So, as you might know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the newly established United Nations in December 1948. And the context was one after the Second World War. The context was one where this was in response to the barbarous acts which outraged the conscience of mankind during the Second World War, right? So, the recognition and its adoption really sort of recognize human rights as the foundation for freedom, for justice, and for peace. So, work on this Human Rights Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights began in 1946. There was a drafting committee. It consisted of various countries in the world, including the US, Lebanon, China, and representatives from Australia, France, Chile, Soviet Union. So, the idea was that the document benefited tremendously from contributions from all regions in the world, their diverse religious, political, cultural contexts, and the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was it was discussed by all members and then eventually adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. So, what the Declaration of Human Rights, what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does is it outlines 30 rights and freedoms that belong to all of us and that nobody can take away from us. And these rights continue to form the basis of international human rights law today, and therefore the declaration remains a living document. So, like I mentioned, there are 30 articles, and over here you can see specifically several articles which are universal and therefore very, very relevant in the context of migration. So, like we saw, Article 1 is related to all human beings being born equal and equal in dignity and rights. Article 2 then goes on to say that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in the declaration, and no distinction is to be made on the basis of political, jurisdictional or international status of the country or territory to which the person belongs. So, this is fundamentally important in terms of migration. Article 4 is related to slavery and servitude. Article 5 is related to torture and cruelty. And you can see how in the context of, several streams of migration, these articles might still be very relevant today. And then again, now look at Article 23. This is specifically related to work. And again, and as you know, migration streams predominate in work. So the idea that everyone has a right to work, they have a free choice of employment, and that they have just and favorable conditions of work and protection against unemployment. This is fundamental to all workers, right? Whether they are migrant or not. Similarly, working without discrimination, right to equal pay for equal work, and then the right to just and favorable remuneration, and ensuring that a worker and their family has an existence worthy of human dignity, and if necessary, it should be protected by social protection, that everybody has right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of their interests. These are very, very fundamental rights, and when you look at it from the lens of migration, you realize that how far we are from people exercising their rights or attaining these rights, right? And then Article 24, everyone has the right to rest and leisure, including reasonable limitation of working hours and periodic holidays and pay. Then Article 25, to do with everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of themselves, their family. This is very important, and we also know how, again, in the context of not only migrant workers but many kinds of workers, these rights are far from being fulfilled. Specifically, Article 13 and 14 have to do with freedom of movement and also the right to seek asylum. So what does Article 13 say? Article 13 argues that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. And everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Now you see, even now we find restrictions of human movement by nation states, and so one of the main sources of understanding, of studying restrictions on human movement is the NGO Freedom House. And Freedom House collects data on formal, informal restrictions, on formal travels, on informal travels, and so on. And it's very, very striking to find that even given the context of Article 13 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in today's day and age, Freedom House finds that over 1/3 of the countries in the world restrict movement, and they impose significant restrictions on the freedom of movement, whether it's within the country or outside the country. And now coming to Article 14, Article 14 very simply and powerfully puts forward the point that everybody has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum for persecution. So if there's persecution, it could be political persecution, every individual has the right to seek asylum. Now, at a time like today, where asylum policies are so under attack in the developed world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is something that we really need to look back as a model grounding of the understanding of individual rights, of worker rights, and migrant rights. Now, let us come to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So, you see, we went through the Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948, right? And a more recent, and we saw what a progressive framework it was, and a more recent framework is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So, as you all know, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it recognizes, there are 17 goals, right? there are 17 goals, and there are several targets and indicators and so on. Now, in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, for the first time, the contribution of migration to sustainable development has been recognized. And human rights are really at the heart of this. Now, migration is a cross-cutting issue in the 2030 agenda, and it's relevant literally to all of the SDGs. And the SDGs also have a very clear motto that in the call for sustainable development, migrants are important, because the general motto is that sustainable development has to be inclusive and it should not leave anybody behind. At least 10 of the 17 goals contain targets and indicators that are very directly related to migration or mobility. And so, but one of the fundamental issues is that the inclusion of migration in the 2030 agenda, it sort of presents all countries with various challenges, including data challenges. And so we all know how migration data is very hard to collect, and different countries have different ways. So even to be able to understand progress on certain issues, to track certain issues related to migration, there are several data challenges. But at the same time, this also presents a crucial opportunity to improve migration data. So now let us look at very specifically what is it that the UN SDGs have to say about migration. So the very first direct target is target 10.7. Target 10.7 is related to facilitate orderly, safe, regular and responsible migration and mobility of people, including implementing planned and well-managed migration policies, which is in goal 10, which has to do with reducing inequality between and within countries. Apart from target 10.7, there are also other targets that make direct connections to migration topics, including labor migration, international student mobility, human trafficking, remittances, migration data and more. So let's discuss these in a little more detail. Let's discuss first targets 8.7 and 8.8, which are related to growth and employment. So 8.7 says that we need to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and end modern slavery, human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers. Then we come to target 8.8. Target 8.8 again related to growth and employment, and it argues for protecting labor rights, for promotion of safe and secure working environments for all workers, including migrant workers, in particular women migrants and those in precarious employment. Now, what about 4.B? 4.B has to do with education and specifically related to student mobility, and the idea is that we need to substantially expand globally the number of scholarships available to developing countries, in particular the least developed countries, small island developing states and African countries, for enrollment in higher education, including vocational training and information and communication technology, technical, engineering and scientific programs in developed countries and other developing countries. Now, I cannot emphasize enough how important this target is, and specifically at a time like this where we are seeing major cutbacks and drawbacks in international student migration. This is one point on the SDG agenda that really needs to be reiterated and reaffirmed by various policy actors and nation states. Now, let us come to the ones related to human trafficking. So 5.2. 5.2, target 5.2 is in the broad area of gender equality, and it argues that we need to eliminate all forms of violence against all women and girls in the public and private spheres, including trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation And then let us now come to 8.7. What is 8.7? 8.7 again related to growth and employment, and the target calls for taking immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor and modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure and the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment of child soldiers. Now, let us come to 16.2. What is 16.2? 16.2 largely has to do with the goal of peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. And 16.2 is related to the ending of abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence and torture against children. Now coming to remittances, remittances is in the broad goal of reducing inequalities, and target 10.6 has to do with a reduction to less than 3% the transaction cost of migrant remittances, and elimination of remittance corridors with costs higher than 5%. So the idea is that it's expensive to remit, and the cost of sending remittances should not be that high, and we need to bring them down to 3%, and we should eliminate migration corridors where remittances cost more than 5% to remit. The last point is related to migration data, and the target is that we should enhance capacity building support to developing countries, including the least developed countries, and to increase significantly the availability of high quality, timely, and reliable data. And we should also have data that can be disaggregated by income, gender, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, disability, geographical location, and other characteristics which are relevant in the national context. So remember, data is very, very important. And if we don't collect migrant data, if we don't collect data related to migration, and this is more relevant in the context of internal migration than international migration really, but if we don't collect data, then migration becomes invisible. So that doesn't mean that migration doesn't exist, but it's just that we don't know anything about it. So it's very, very important to collect data on migration, and that is also something the SDGs reiterate. Now, there's one convention that I want to draw your attention to. It's the UN Convention, it's the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members and their Families. So what this UN Convention does is that it delineates the responsibility of the state to protect the rights of the migrant, and now it's a very important convention, but only 60 countries in the world have ratified it. The other issue is that it's mainly sending countries that have ratified it. So, sending countries such as Mexico, Morocco, Philippines. For those countries, the convention is a very important way to protect the human rights of their citizens, of their migrants living abroad. But the problem is that not a single destination country has ratified it. Whether it's a European country or a North American country or countries in the Middle East. So therefore then in such a context, it also tells us something about the global framework, the global architecture, where receiving countries are not very interested in protecting the human rights of migrants, whereas the sending countries are. So it tells us something about the inequality between sending and receiving countries, and we're going to discuss this more as we move along. So now this brings me to the debate on migration, development, and human rights, right? And we're looking at Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues' paper that tries to emphasize the structural aspects of this migration and development and its tension with human rights. And to understand that, we also then need to understand that the nature of migration, specifically in the era of globalization, is something which is different, and we are going to study it in a bit before we move ahead. So what Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues are arguing is that, of course, the relationship between migration, development and human rights, it's a topic of growing interest. Who's interested in this? International organizations, academics, civil society organizations, also organizations like the World Bank and the International Organization for Migration. And all of this is linked with looking at remittances as an essential tool for migrant sending countries from migrant receiving countries, right? And so what is also fundamental in this contemporary migration and development regime is that international migration management is a core element of this regime, right? So, and international migration management is largely done by nation states. And like you may remember the lecture we had on migration infrastructure, where Zhang and Lindquist argue that much of the infrastructure is actually at the end of the sending state, right? And so this international migration management is really a core element of migration policies, which are considered to be beneficial for all parties, right? So this is also known as the triple win. So that migration and therefore remittances are beneficial for the source region or the migrant sending regions, for the destination region, migration receiving region, and migrants themselves. So all parties in migration, the sending region, the receiving region and migrants themselves benefit from migration, and this is largely the discourse of the contemporary migration and development regime. But what Raul Delgado Weiss and his colleagues argue is that this dominant perspective, this dominant migration and development perspective, which has been there in the policy agenda, which has been there in economic agendas for long, it's essentially one-sided and it's decontextualized, it's reductionist, and therefore it is misleading. So they argue that this perspective, the contemporary migration and development perspective, it overlooks the realm of neoliberal globalization, and we need to look at this context of neoliberal globalization and unequal development in which contemporary migration is embedded. They also argue that this perspective disregards human rights and labor rights, and therefore it also then draws on exploitation, social exclusion, human insecurity, and also criminalization suffered by international migrants. And more importantly, it also masks the positive contribution, the fundamental positive contribution made by migrants in destination countries. It ignores the costs of migration and is unable to see the impact of migration in source region as anything beyond the positive impact of remittances. So what they say is that, so the purpose of reframing the debate on migration, development, human rights is then to kind of also look at the lens of global capitalist development within which contemporary migration is located, and then highlight the tensions between this and human rights, and then eventually then they argue that we need a new way of looking at migration if we are really interested in securing human rights, and this new way needs to be inclusive, it needs to be comprehensive, and it needs to be human-centered. So now, why do we need to talk about this alternative approach, right, to migration, development, and human rights? It's largely because they argue that the mainstream migration and development approach is skewed in its positive focus on remittances. Now, what has really happened is that in the neoliberal economic regime, which has existed since the 1970s, since the 1980s in Latin America and many other parts of the world, you've had structural adjustment policies. And these structural adjustment policies in the global south have led to privatization, deregulation, liberalization, and in all of this, production systems have been dismantled. There has been a complete disregard for labor and employment policies, and it is in this context that unequal development has increased, inequalities have increased, and there has been an oversupply of labor. So you will have underemployment in source regions, unemployment in source regions, lack of appropriate employment for young people, and so on. Now, it is in this context that we also find new kinds of migration, right? New kinds of migration, these migrations are linked to a global demand for labor, a global demand for precarious labor, a global demand for labor in very many sectors of the economy, like domestic work, as we saw with the feminization of migration, construction labor, and so on and so forth, right? And a lot of these new streams of migration, they are temporary migration streams, they come with risks, they come with their own dangers, much of the work is precarious. You also have migration due to violence, conflict, and catastrophe. And this is also linked with broader processes of climate change, wherein many source regions which are bearing the brunt of climate change and agriculture, natural resource systems have been affected adversely, and you have new streams of migration coming from there as well. There is also a context of human trafficking and smuggling, and this has really increased in an alarming rate in recent years. And this has become a very, very lucrative business, and because you also have restrictive policies in receiving countries, increased hardship in less developed ones, human trafficking has also increased. And human trafficking is largely associated with coercion, abduction, fraud. It includes sexual exploitation, illicit adoption, and therefore serious violations of human rights. And what has been the global response? The global response to this has been very, very sort of limited, right? So on the one hand, you do have some UN conventions and so on, specifically the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and you also have a protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. But however, you have 2.5 to 3 million people who are currently engaged in forced labor, and as a consequence of both internal and international human trafficking. So this is also human trafficking and smuggling is also very, very closely linked with the nature of our development process, with unequal development, and so on. And then you have migration due to dispossession, exclusion, unemployment. In many source regions, there is a lack of employment opportunity. There isn't enough work for people to do. And so therefore, in these adverse situations, people have to migrate, right? And all of this then is happening at a time where, like I said, since the post-war times, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the fundamental human rights are therefore being subverted systematically, they are being undermined, and largely due to demands of a market economy, which is at the service of global capital. So, in this context of forced scenario, you also have human rights which are very important, right? So, of course, the right to development is one. In the post-Second World War scenario, as many countries in the global south became independent and had their own projects and programs of development, the right to development is a fundamental part of nation states, right? And one of this also is that the right not to migrate. I mean, of course, we've spoken in the past about how mobility is a human right, and mobility should not be curtailed. And of course, that point is very well taken. But you should also not be forced to migrate. So, in the context of distress migration, in the context of forced migration, we also need to have the right to development establish itself and execute itself and operationalize itself in such a manner that people have the right not to migrate. They should have the right to stay where they want to stay, and they should not be forced or compelled to migrate. And so therefore, the right not to migrate is as important as the right to the freedom of movement. And of course, along with the right to migrate, the right not to migrate, the freedom not to migrate, the freedom to migrate, we also need certain basic fundamental rights of migrants and their families. Now, here I want to emphasize on one of the examples of institutionalized discrimination against migrant workers through immigration policy, right? So remember, we're talking about the overarching framework of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that all persons are born equal, right? And then we looked at how Raul Delgado Wise are sort of, taking us through processes of contemporary development, where the neoliberal economic agenda is very, very prominent, and therefore we see a deterioration of labor rights, worker rights, and migrant rights. And how does this then translate into immigration policies of developed countries? So this is from the UN Human Development Report 2009 on which addresses barriers to mobility. So what you can see is that there are proactive preferential immigration policies for skilled workers in developed countries. So the pathway to immigration is not the same for all workers, and we can see in the graph that the migration pathways in the contemporary global capitalist system are mediated by the countries of the north, and they are mediated through a skilled regime. Now, we don't have much time to discuss about skilled regimes per se, but what you can clearly see is that this creates a class of workers with differentiated pathways to migration and citizenship. So you see, in permanent immigration, as you can see in the slide, highly skilled workers dominate, whereas in temporary immigration, low skilled workers from the developing countries dominate. So therefore, it's no surprise that human rights violations are most rampant for this category of workers. And so therefore, contemporary global migration regimes exacerbate the inequalities between migrant workers from the same source to destination region, where specific categories of workers are vulnerable to abuse, vulnerable to exploitation, and they must endure family separation, and they have no pathway to permanent immigration. And it is this unequal and discriminatory global migration regime, the global migration skill regime, that in turn I believe is associated with the growth of more unsafe and irregular migration streams. And then this is coming back to Raul Delgado Wise and his colleagues, and therefore, this is the dialectics of unequal development and forced migration linked with human rights, right? And so therefore, you have unequal development which generates forced migration, and in this context, immigrants contribute to development in receiving countries in a context of increasing labor precariousness and social exclusion. And immigrants also contribute to their home countries again in a context of precariousness and socioeconomic stability. So therefore, if we want to look at how to prevent forced migration, we really need to look at the promotion of alternative development as social transformation. We need to also look at development differently. We need to imagine and conceptualize development differently. And over here, we can, if you look at the concept of human development, coined by Amartya Sen, adopted by the UN. So it's a positive step in furthering the development debate. But however, this alone cannot adequately address the complex dynamics of unequal development post-migration and human rights infringement that we have discussed under globalization. So what we really need is, there's a need for further contextualization. We need to look at the various social projects, and we need to look at the viable pathways that can lead to political strengthening, institutional strengthening of organizations and social movements that work on transformative agendas related to alternative development. And Delgado Wise and his colleagues also then argue that we need to rethink human development, not only in terms of individual freedom and free markets, but also from the point of view of equality. And at the same time, we need to think of development as something beyond neoliberal models of economic development, globalization, that sort of draw on underdevelopment and dependence, and we need to think of a post-neoliberal perspective. And how can we do this? And for this, then we need to reframe the debate on migration, development, and human rights. And at the moment, empirically, there is a divergence between development and human rights. So how is it that we can bring it back to the progressive ideas of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? So for this, they suggest three broad ways of doing this. The first is comprehensiveness, the second is humanism, and the third is inclusion, right? And a post-neoliberal perspective then needs to focus on all of these three issues. So very quickly, let me take you through what they mean by these. So by comprehensiveness, they argue that we need to look and understand migration from the context of the larger development processes which are unequal, right? So therefore, we need to focus on the asymmetrical relationship between sending and receiving countries. We need to look at the social, economic, political, environmental and cultural factors that inhibit development and that cause forced migration. We need to focus on the risks and dangers faced by migration. We need to specifically look at the role of migrants in receiving economies where they contribute so much but it's not acknowledged. We need to constantly focus on the violation of migrants' human rights, their labor rights, and we also need to look at the costs paid by countries and local governments that have high migration. I mean, the social costs of migration are immense. And lastly, a comprehensive perspective, they argue, it demands a careful consideration of alternative policies to promote development and the agents responsible for steering this. The next point that they focus is on inclusion, and very quickly, what do they mean by inclusion? So again, they say that the construction of an alternative agenda on development, human rights and migration demands that we have the participation of various actors, of various agents that are diverse from both sending countries and receiving countries, that are able to put forward the interests of migrants, right? And then for this, you really need to have an open and free debate about ideas, about access to information, about social organization. And alternative spaces to express these views must exist. And it's in this context that they argue that efforts and initiatives deployed by all levels of government must be considered. And last, let's come to humanism. Now, this I feel is very, very important. So unequal development is characterized by increasingly dehumanizing social relations. And this is something we see around us every day, which degrade people and they literally threaten the pillars of civilization. And migrants are often treated as degradable, segregated, disposable human resources, and they're even treated as criminals. So an alternative agenda then requires a reassessment of the value of labor, of the transformative capacity of labor, which is really at the core of the generation of wealth. We need to ensure a decent, secure and well remunerated employment. under conditions of gender equality, ethnic equality. They argue that the new agenda must retrieve the humanistic thrust of social development, and it should not only guarantee the fundamental human rights of migrants and their families, but also seek to eliminate all forms of exploitation which enable the full realization of human, individual and collective freedom regardless of race, gender or social condition. With this, we come to the end of this lecture, and the broad references for this are listed in this slide, and I hope you found the lecture useful. Thank you very much.